received by Sal Rachel, May 9, 2005. Greetings, beloved creators. Today begins a very special series. Most of you reading this message have attended history courses in grammar school, secondary school and college. This will be unlike any history course you've taken in your so-called traditional Earth schools. Today we will look at the true history of your Earth. This scribe has written a brief history of Earth in his book, but even that is incomplete. We will attempt to outline your planetary history in a broader stroke of the paintbrush, keeping in mind that time and space are illusory in nature, and any portrait of timelines is subject to distortion. The time frames we give here are the rough equivalents to your current 3D timeline. However, as this channel and many others have recently indicated, time can be changed and modified by your own awareness. Therefore, history is not written in stone, but is an ongoing tapestry of events, continually being rearranged and rewritten. All of time is like an infinitely large fabric, and each thread represents a probable or possible reality. The 3D world is a series of threads that are imprinted in the Akashic energy medium. Each event in 3D is an imprint, and this electrical impulse is recorded as having actually happened. Yet any event that has actually happened can be moved into another timeline, and you, beloveds, can jump from one timeline to another, both individually and collectively. Therefore, if you desire to change history, you can simply select another thread in the fabric and make that your new timeline. In your physics, you call experiments with this idea quantum entanglement. With this brief disclaimer, as you like to call it, we will begin. This universe you find yourselves in began about 20 billion years ago as a point of light within the mind of God. This point of light was contained within a greater point of light, which was contained within a greater point, etc., into infinity. There is an aspect of the Godhead that has always existed and that expands and contracts an infinite number of times. All of life is continually expanding and contracting, much like that device you look through with the colored glass, the kaleidoscope. During one of the expansion phases, approximately 4.5 billion years ago, your world you call Earth was formed out of primordial dust and gas. Like all newly formed worlds, it was mostly hydrogen and a few other gases, not containing the kind of life you know. Throughout this physical-chemical process, the Godhead, in an expansion phase, differentiated itself into units of consciousness, which later became known as souls. These original souls, called the founders, are what we represent to you. We were the original sparks of light that were showered out from the infinite source during this expansion. Our individuality began approximately 1 billion years ago, and we went forth to explore the creation. We found millions of planets in their early stages of development, including your world, and we remained in the form of sparks, although actually to you we look like large blue-white stars. Due to our relatively rarefied level of vibration, compared to the vibratory states of these worlds, we were unable to experience life directly on any of these worlds, so we would simply overlight, or hover above the atmosphere of these worlds and observe the chemical processes taking place. At some point in the distorted time-space continuum, we decided to embed a tiny part of ourselves into the evolving worlds in order to experience them more directly. To do this, we created a multitude of energy patterns, precursors to what you call the DNA molecule. You would call these precursors light packets of conscious energy. These light packets were able to descend in vibration down to what you would call the 9th or 10th density. At that point, we were able to create intricate configurations of light codes, which you now call DNA keys. These DNA keys were the actual building blocks of life as you know it. We then densified these keys down to what you call seventh density, the first level of the actual DNA codes. As seventh density beings, we were finally able to experience this expanding universe directly as inhabitants of evolving worlds. We scattered our seed throughout the universe, going to many regions of the ever-expanding galactic clusters. As the clusters differentiated further into individual galaxies, we began the process described above and incarnated into several regions of each galaxy. Your galaxy, the one you call the Milky Way, was seeded in several quadrants. Your quadrant began in what you call the Lyra, Vega region. It is here that the first seventh density forms were manifested, through manipulating and permutating the DNA codes. It took us nearly 900 million years to perfect this process, and it is only within the last 100 million years that we were able to create life forms in all the densities down to third density. The process of differentiation is difficult for most Earth souls to comprehend. The best analogy we can give is that of cellular division. Each cell that divides from a parent cell becomes an individual cell in its own right, just as powerful and creative as the parent cell, if not more so. Each 3D, 4D, 5D, 6D or 7D being that fragmented off from our parent selves, our 12th density core, became a sovereign being, or whole and complete soul, as it grew and evolved through time and space. At the same time, each fragment, as it becomes aware of its higher aspects, is able to align, or connect with, those higher aspects, and thereby remember what the state of undifferentiated source energy is like. In essence, each fragment of ourselves is intimately connected to our core, and our core is intimately connected to the Godhead, the undifferentiated, infinite source. The process of descending into form is called devolution. An aspect of the Godhead, us, becomes more and more differentiated and extends itself outward into lower and lower densities, actually becoming more and more dense, until it reaches the level of simple existence. In other words, a part of ourselves extended outward all the way to the level of pure elemental awareness, or first density. This is the density of what you call non-organic existence, the simplest manifestation of which is the hydrogen element. Once hydrogen is imbued with consciousness, the process of evolution begins. Of course, your scientists cannot measure the level of consciousness in first density because it is minute in comparison to third density. However, your scientists have discovered what you call the quark and you have a measurement you call Planck's constant. These units are aspects of first density consciousness, and are the means to measure the forces behind quantum fluctuations. However, we realize we are speaking to a general audience through this medium and will therefore refrain from a technical scientific discussion. In part 2 we will discuss the beginnings of evolution on your planet, corresponding to the time period between 100 million and 10 million years ago. This is the end of part 1. We are the founders, continuing with part 2 shortly. The Founders on Earth History Part 2. Received by Sal Rachel, May 10, 2005. Note, this is a continuation of the discussion began yesterday with our beloved guides, the Founders. Greetings, once again. We are the Founders, happy to help illuminate your path of awakening. Yesterday we began a discourse on the true history of your planet, But we didn't get very far, only to the point where the humanoid form began propagating throughout the universe. This form you have come to know so well, with its arms, legs, torso, head, etc., was the result of genetic experimentation and research comprising a very long period of time, about 900 million of your Earth years. During that time, all manner of exotic life forms were created by permutating the DNA, strands and structures. Most of the animal life you are familiar with was brought forth as a side effect of this research. Forgive us, but we are going to back up a bit. This is a vast subject to most of your peoples, and we do not want to leave anything out. Life exists in many forms, some of which you would not even recognize if it were right in front of you. There are carbon-based life forms, silicon-based life forms, and even lithium-based life forms. These are sentient beings with at least a rudimentary understanding and awareness of their presence and the love of the Creator. All life began in the simplest of states. As we mentioned briefly in part 1, even hydrogen has a level of awareness. The Creator, in the form of us, began experimenting with different life forms. We found we could take the rudimentary consciousness of a hydrogen atom, or a heavier metallic element, and permutate the atomic structure, thus creating new and varying forms of life. All life forms we created had a natural tendency to become more organized over time, and more sophisticated, gradually growing in self-awareness. The natural evolution of life forms followed what you call the Darwinian evolutionary model. All of our experiments, and the experiments of other groups like us, were represented by mutations or periods punctuated with intense growth and alteration of form and structure. Your scientists do not understand why there are so many mutations and alterations in living organisms. We are offering an explanation. As life began evolving from first density up through the various mineral and plant stages, there eventually came a level of sophistication and awareness, known as the animal stage, wherein it became possible for the higher density souls to incarnate directly into the flesh and blood of these evolving life forms. This is the part that is hard to understand for most of you, but it is as if a tiny fragment of yourself, the animal consciousness, was reunited with the larger part of yourself, your 7D consciousness. To incarnate into an animal form, the tiny aspect, the consciousness of the animal, would have to merge with the larger aspect, the consciousness of the incarnating soul. The cosmic in-breath involves the merging and assimilating of soul fragments into larger and larger conglomerations of consciousness. Incarnation is one way this process is accomplished. The pinnacle of this evolutionary process is the humanoid form. This humanoid form you find yourselves embodying was originally designed to be capable of experiencing 7 different dimensions simultaneously. It had the capability to sit, stand, walk, run, leap, fly, and teleport itself from one place to another. All of these were considered valuable experiences of physicality and ethereality, for this body you inhabit was quasi-physical in the sense that it could be made translucent and fluid, or it could be as solid as you experience it now. This body was designed specifically to work with the gravitational and electromagnetic fields of evolving planets, and its density could be shifted at will, from the 1st through 7th level. During the 900 million year period of experimentation, there were many strange and exotic forms walking upon your planet. You are familiar with some of them, including the dinosaurs. These DNA forms were created as byproducts of our research, and the research of other groups who worked with us. There was a period known in your mythology as the Land of Pan. This civilization took place near the beginning of the 100 million year cycle, which is, incidentally, about 1/2 of a revolution of your Sun around the central sun of your galaxy. During the time of Pan, or Pangaea, as it is sometimes called, the DNA experimentation was still going on, and there were no safeguards built into the Earth laboratory. This meant that various life forms could interbreed and create other exotic blends and hybrids. You are perhaps familiar with the Pegasus and Centaur and other creatures resembling a cross between horses and man, or horses and angels. There were many bizarre creatures roaming your world, all a product of genetic experimentation and interspecies breeding. Embedded within the genetic codes of every species was the infinite Creator's plan of evolution, known as the in-breath of creation. The in-breath of creation issues forth the universal law of increasing intelligence and self-awareness. All life forms during the in-breath have a blueprint of ascension along the evolutionary spiral, and so as the bizarre life forms of Pan began to grow in awareness, they developed various levels of judgment and discernment, through various mental and emotional faculties. They began to become aware of their Creator, and they also began to become aware that they were spirits embedded in various physical and etheric forms. As sparks of the original undifferentiated source energy, they felt a longing to return to that source. They began to realize that a part of that source had split off from the vastness of love and light, and was going through this outer experience of embodiment. This is the allegorical reference to the tree of knowledge of good and evil in your religious teachings. These life forms were given a realm of creation in which to learn how to become gods in their own right. This realm is known as the fourth dimension, or the realm of mind and knowledge and imagination. Within the blueprint of every life form is the desire to create like the Creator, just as within every child born of a human parent are the potentialities, hopes and desires of the parents. Every spark of divinity, as it experienced the various physical embodiments and species, was also developing its desire to become a creator. The infinite Creator made a decision, a long time ago in earthly terms, to place no limits on what could be created by its fledgling children. This was known as the law of free will, and this law has been the source of all pain and misery upon your world and countless others. The Creator gave each one of you the ability to create unlike the perfect blueprint. Within your fourth dimensional canvas, you could paint any picture you desired, from the lovely to the grotesque. The Creator wanted to experience every conceivable idea and see it manifest on the canvas of the imagination. And so it is that many of the Creator's fledgling life forms experimented with their own DNA, to the point of creating misshapen, malformed and convoluted creatures, with similar convoluted mental processes. Many of the sparks of divinity, souls, who ventured into these uncharted realms became so mesmerized by their own creations that they forgot there were seventh density beings of the Creator's light and love. As they became more and more immersed in these lower densities, they became identified with the physicality and ethereality of these realms. This is referred to in your religious teachings as the original fall from grace. A popular present-day analogy on your world would be the experience of going into a movie theater. When you are deeply engrossed in the movie, you forget about the outside world, until the movie is over, and then you wander, dazed and confused, out of the movie theater, slowly piecing together the reality you left just 2 hours earlier. However, in the case of your fall, the 2 hours is more like 100 million years. So, beloveds, we have two processes unfolding here. The first is the process of evolution, from a tiny spark of divinity that begins as inanimate objects of first density and slowly evolves through more and more sophisticated levels of genetic configurations, eventually making its way back to the Godhead. Then, at the same time, we have the process of devolution, wherein souls differentiate out of the Godhead as 12th density, beings of light, and gradually drop their vibration down until they reach the 7th density, wherein they take the form of luminous beings of light. It is at that point that they then differentiate further through the process of incarnation, until they are able to experience all the levels of evolution, from a grain of sand to the source from whence they came. In future segments of this discussion, we will examine how evolution and devolution are intertwined, and how souls possessing free will have the capabilities of entering into any level or dimension of creation and experiencing that level or levels. We will also continue with the history of your Earth, examining the civilizations that have come and gone from your world over time, and we will explore the various star races that have incarnated and invaded your world and influenced the life forms evolving on Earth. We are the founders. This is the end of part 2. The Founders on Earth History. Part 3. Received by Sal Rachel, May 11, 2005. Greetings again, beloved creators. We are continuing our discourse on Earth history. We hope you were able to follow yesterday's lesson. It is a hard one to comprehend for most Earth souls, because there are multiple energy streams happening simultaneously, evolution, devolution and constancy, at very high levels. Today we will actually get down to the historical events of your timeline. As we and the channel have mentioned many times previously, time is fluid and not set in stone as your rational minds would have you believe. Therefore, much of what we chronicle for you is subject to change. Although the physical events have Akashic imprints, and will continue to exist on one of your past timelines, you as a species have the capabilities of changing your timelines to better suit your evolution. We will address that subject in greater depth at another time. We are not fond of issuing disclaimers in our communications because we want our words and ideas to stand simply as they are, without embellishment or compromise. However, it might be useful to point out that some of the ideas presented herein will echo what has been brought forth in your mythological and religious teachings, and some of it will likely contradict the writings and teachings you are already familiar with. We are not here to convert anyone to a particular way of thinking, or convince you of anything. We ask that you remain open to our viewpoint of creation, perhaps realizing that we have a broader perception than most entities that have visited your world. How's that for a modest disclaimer? There have been 4 major civilizations, and a lot of minor ones, on your planet, since the grand experiment began unfolding here. 1. Pangaea, 2. Lemuria, 3. Atlantis, and 4. The present. In addition, there have been 2 major events in your solar system that dramatically impacted the history of your world. A. The destruction of Maldek, and B. The destruction of the surface of Mars. We are simplifying the story considerably, because there were numerous other events, some of which we will be going into in detail. These would include what your religious writings call the Luciferian Rebellion, which we refer to as the Orion Invasion, the infusion of the Alpha Draconians, Reptilians, the reign of the Syrians, your biblical and pre-biblical times, and the quiet invasion of the Zeta Reticulans, Greys. Keep in mind that these are only the major Reti infusions. There were many others, including input from certain Andromedan sectors, various levels and dimensions of Pleiadian groups, Venusians, Arcturians, Antarians, and others from Polaris, Alpha Centauri, and many other regions. Add to this the overseeing of your progress by the councils of Alcyone, the Great White Brotherhood, the Confederations of Light and their offshoots, Ash Star, Solar Cross, etc., and the many interplanetary priesthoods, Melchizedek, Metatron, Enoch, etc., and you have quite a bowl of porridge on the cosmic stove. Well, as you say, let's get on with it. Let's start with Pangaea. We briefly talked about this civilization yesterday in part 2, but let's put it into the historic timeline. The land of Pan was the pinnacle of success regarding the experimentation and interbreeding of various DNA strains. This was the paradise, or Garden of Eden, written about in your religious books. Most of the Earth was tropical jungle during the period from 200 million to 20 million years ago. You can see evidence of this by examining the geological formations, particularly in your desert areas. For example, the barren desert area known as the Petrified Forest in northeastern Arizona was once dense jungle. Many areas, including your favorite hotspot, Sedona, was underwater for much of that time. In other words, your world was bathed in water and dense vegetation, in most areas. Even the polar regions were teeming with life. The humanoid form was seeded on your planet approximately 100 million years ago, right in the middle of this jungle period. There were small groups of humanoids confined to relatively small areas of your world. These humanoids were seventh density beings with wings and highly developed telepathic and psychic abilities. They lived in paradise. They were loving and cooperative and communicated with the exotic plant and animal life that abounded everywhere. They extracted their food directly from sunlight, and assimilated water through their pores. They had need of nothing but each other. This is a rough equivalent of what you call the Garden of Eden in your religious writings. The life forms during that time were varied and plentiful. About 60 million years ago, the dinosaurs were killed off when the comet Churyumov made its 10,500-year cycle and came too close to Earth on this particular pass. The resulting cool down destroyed a large part of the vegetation, but the Earth, in her amazing regenerative ways, was able to bounce back, and another fertile period ensued. There were only a few 100,000 humanoid forms on Earth at that time, and most of them retreated underground, and with the help of various Pleiadian factions, created a subterranean world of great beauty and intricacy. This is where the legends of an inner Earth came from. We will talk about that at a later time. Most of the life forms of Pan were exotic and do not exist today. There are legends of a few of them, including the Pegasus and Centaur, no relation to Alpha Centaurians, and some of the creatures were descendants of the dinosaurs and early reptiles. The dragons got their folklore from two sources, Pangaea and the Draconian invasion. The early dragons were reptilian creatures that evolved along with the dinosaurs and were genetically manipulated by us and other ET groups. Later, the Draconians came to Earth with their own reptilian form and began interbreeding and creating exotic dragon forms. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The fall of Pangaea was the original fall from grace as chronicled in your writings. This occurred when the sons of God, the seventh density Pleiadians, incarnated into the humanoid forms evolving on Earth and forgot their divine connection. The humanoid forms, before the incarnation of the seventh density Pleiadians, had a rudimentary consciousness somewhere between second and third density. Your evolutionary scientists see the change brought about by the Pleiadian incarnations as an unexplained mutation that marks the difference between apes and humans. The incarnated Pleiadian humans interbred with the various creatures, hence the half-horse half-man and many others. The fairy kingdom was one of the offshoots of this interbreeding. Seventh density souls took on a humanoid form that had wings. When they interbred with the four-legged creatures, one of the results was the Pegasus, on-winged horse. As the humanoid Pleiadian souls dropped in vibration, their wings became atrophied, along with their telepathic and other abilities. They became more and more like the creatures evolving on Earth, more animalistic in nature and less able to formulate higher intellectual reasoning abilities. All this continued until approximately 10 million years ago, when the end of the cosmic cycle occurred and the electromagnetic polarities shifted. At that time, great storms raged across the Earth. As a result of the changing M frequencies, a flood wiped out most of the creatures residing on Earth. This is referred to in your religious writings as the Great Flood. At that time, most of the Earth became covered in water, with a few remnants of land and life remaining here and there. This is the end of part 3. We are the founders. The Founders on Earth History. Part 4. Received by Sal Rachel, May 12, 2005. Greetings, beloveds. We are the Founders. The channel wanted to make sure we let everybody know that our messages will be contained in a book at some point. What is your Earth expression? Don't hold your breath waiting. Okay, we are trying to have a sense of humor here. Apparently writing a book takes a fair amount of concentration and such. The actual receiving of the information is quite straightforward, but it is the preparation, editing and production of the book that requires the energetic output. At any rate, today we examine the major wars and infusions of souls onto your world that marked the beginning of what you call violence and conflict. For many of you, this will not be a pretty picture, but I suspect most of you are mature souls now and can handle a little unpleasantry, amidst all the glorious creation. Your Earth was not the only planet in your system that received ET attention. 10 million years ago there were 3 planets that harbored life forms: Earth, Mars and Maldek. These were the 3rd, 4th and 5th planets from your Sun at the time. Yes, the environment on the 4th and 5th planets was colder and less hospitable than on Earth, but that did not stop the ETs from colonizing these worlds. Those that came to Mars and Maldek were adventurous sorts, willing to endure harsh winters and barren landscapes that dotted these planets, although there were forests and plant life in the equatorial regions, and plenty of water and ice in the polar regions. Many of those souls that perished during the Great Flood of Earth reincarnated on Mars and Maldek. The civilizations already developing on those worlds were from many different star systems, and now the Pleiadian root race joined the mix. As you can imagine, the beings now residing on those worlds had dropped in vibration to the 4th density. Souls born into a 4th density world did not receive the same kind of loving attention that souls in 7th density experience. These outer planets were therefore a repository for a bizarre array of thought forms and thought creations, thereby resulting in a rich and varied astral realm, the realm of thought creation, imagination and the dream state. Throughout this period, many beings from across the galaxy had taken notice of the Earth experiment and its neighboring planets. A group of souls from the Draco star system sent scout craft to Earth about 40 million years ago, and again roughly 1 or 2 million years before the Great Flood, about 12 million years ago. Although they did not settle en masse, their reports back to the Draconian councils put Earth, Mars and Maldek on the map for exploration and possible conquest. Another group, from the constellation of Orion, also took notice of the fledgling Earth souls and their compatriots on Mars and Maldek. We of the 7th and 12th densities were still monitoring the Earth experiment closely, and these less than savory civilizations from Orion and Draco were not able to gain a foothold on Earth due to our careful observation. It would have like marching into our laboratory and announcing they were taking over the experiment. We had a protective vibration around Earth and things like this didn't happen, at least not at that time. However, the same protections were not afforded Mars and Maldek because, quite frankly, that was not our terrain. These planets were more of a free-for-all, and so come they did, in small numbers at first, as scouts and small settlements amidst the existing communities. Once interbreeding began to occur, the souls from Orion and Draco began incarnating as well. The Draco-reptilian form found it hard to adapt to the Mars and Maldek environments, and reincarnation became the preferred method of infusing oneself into these worlds. Both the Orion and Draco systems had a wide variety of conscious beings, and the explorers who settled on Mars and Maldek were quite aggressive and warrior-like in their mentality. Their main purpose in coming to Earth's solar system was conquest and mining of natural resources. Basically, anything that would give them power and prestige. These souls had long ago forgotten their connection to Source, and felt they needed to take from others in order to feel whole and complete. It was not long before war started to break out on Mars and Maldek. Due to Mars' proximity to Earth, and the watchful gaze of our members, the Orions and Draconians were less willing to reincarnate in mass numbers on Mars. They preferred the relative distance of Maldek. They began coming in record numbers, and pretty soon the Maldekian civilization numbered in the millions of souls. They built great cities out of stone, and in matching their consciousness, these cities had great fortresses and towers to afford protection from attack. At some point, the Maldekian peoples discovered neutron technology and began manufacturing bombs and wartime implements. At that time, several million years ago, there were no safeguards in place to prevent the runaway consequences of this technology. Although the Maldekian civilization began over 10 million years ago in Earth time, it continued to evolve into a series of warring factions. This warring attracted the attention of both benevolent and malevolent ET groups from various systems around the galaxy, but because of the non-interference agreement and protection of free will, little was done to intervene. About 3,200,000 years ago, the conflicts escalated and the neutron weapons were deployed. It was supposed to be a limited nuclear exchange between two of the warring factions. At this point the DNA of the souls were a mixture of Draconian and Orion strands, both of which contained the aggressive genes. Each side in this conflict, although both sides had similar DNA, wanted to outdo the other, and the weapons grew increasingly larger and more numerous. The first exchange only destroyed a few thousand humanoids. The side most damaged would rebuild and retaliate, each time with greater devastation. Although it seemed to be discovered by accident, a particularly powerful neutron bomb was developed using a rare combination of elemental catalysts. The scientists involved in its development did not realize the extent of its destructive capabilities. This weapon was fired at a military base hidden underground in enemy territory. Within this base were hundreds of neutron weapons. The enemy, realizing the bomb was coming, attempted to get their base weapons airborne. Several dozen of the several hundred weapons were launched and exploded in the sky, creating a brilliant flash. However, they were unable to intercept the oncoming more powerful weapon, and it entered the silos of the enemy and simultaneously ignited over 200 weapons buried in the ground. The combination of the explosion of the more powerful weapon and the 200 conventional nuclear weapons resulted in a powerful earthquake that tore apart the planet of Maldek and eventually broke it into hundreds of fragments, which became the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Over 10 million souls perished in the blast, and these souls later reincarnated on Mars. We and the other benevolent groups were horrified at what happened and petitioned the Godhead for a greater level of intervention to prevent this from ever happening again. The resulting blast altered the orbits of Mars and Earth and severely disrupted the etheric bases on Jupiter and Saturn. A wave of electromagnetic disruption went out from the solar system and beings from all over the galaxy took notice. A council was convened in the Alcyone system, home of the Great White Brotherhood, and it was established that no more complete planetary destruction would be allowed anywhere in the galaxy. This is the end of Part 4. We are the founders. The Founders on Earth History. Part 5. Received by Sal Rachel, May 17, 2005. Greetings, beloved creators. I trust you have found our series so far to be full of intriguing ideas. Has it brought up more questions than it has answered? If so, that's okay. Keep in mind that we are touching upon only the most basic of events and situations and offering our perspective on the dance of duality as it has unfolded over millions of years. Some of you have been asking about the Orions and Draconians, Dracos. We have not gone into detail on these groups because it is not necessary. Suffice to say, our original DNA experiment sort of went astray, to use your earthly language. Other laboratory technicians and inventors came into the lab in the middle of the night and trashed our equipment and stole our samples and did their own experiments on them, and started their own laboratories. Do you like our analogy? We have studied your language and customs for a long time and seem to know how to use the vernacular of your time to make our points. The Earth experiment can be best understood, however, if we continue our saga back in time to just after the destruction of Maldek. Over 10 million souls lost their bodies during the destruction of Maldek. Most of these souls took up residence on Mars, where a civilization was already in progress. The souls on Mars at that time were a product of our experimentation, along with groups from many different systems, including Orion and Alpha Draconis. Those groups left their mark many times along your evolutionary spiral, but never to a sufficient degree as to seriously alter your DNA blueprint, at least not yet. The souls from Maldek incarnated in the usual manner through breeding among the Pleiadian, Orion and Draconian lineage of Mars. The civilization on Mars grew significantly in numbers, until there were over 100 million souls. We will not go into the principles of soul fragmentation at this time, but suffice to say, that the 10 million souls from Maldek fragmented into approximately 50% of the Mars population within a period of only a few thousand years. As the population grew on Mars, the fragile atmosphere became strained. Due to their distance from the Sun, both Mars and Maldek had thin and delicate atmospheres that could not take the strain of large populations, not to mention nuclear weapons. As the Mars civilization continued to grow, unrest between the various factions grew, especially since many of the Maldekian souls had not learned the lessons of war and had left their bodies suddenly during the catastrophic events there. Although most souls are counseled in between lifetimes, there was still a policy of non-interference, except to prevent another planetary explosion, and so Mars inhabitants were pretty much left on their own as long as they did not develop weapons sufficient to destroy the entire planet. The explosion of Maldek had altered the orbit of Mars, and changed the EM frequency band significantly. The climate changed and great canals were built to transport water from the tropical and polar regions into the desert intermediate zones. As the climate continued to become more unstable, wars broke out over water rights and eventually conventional weapons began proliferating. A form of dirty atomic bombs were developed, using heavy metals, uranium, plutonium, etc., and a war broke out using these weapons. Many souls were warned by members of the Brotherhood of Light, later the Confederation of Planets, and were assisted in building underground shelters and eventually underground cities. The Brotherhood and its related organizations neutralized many of the weapons to prevent a repeat of the Maldek experience. Nevertheless, the Martians blew holes in their atmosphere and severely disrupted the ecological balance to the point of rendering most surface life forms extinct. Some survivors of the atomic bomb blasts made their way underground and joined those already there. Once underground, they continued to rebuild their civilization, until a new level of order emerged. Of the approximately 100 million surface souls, about 10 million survived and went underground. To prevent further attacks, the underground cities of Mars were sealed off from the outside world, and scientists managed to create an artificial environment capable of sustaining up to 20 million souls. Over time, great dust storms spread across the surface of Mars and eroded most of the cities and their architecture. Remaining to this day are a few pyramids and rectangular buildings, enough to remind your scientists that there was once life there, although such information has been suppressed from the populace. As for the underground cities, they still exist and are still inhabited to this day, but have evolved into fourth density and are not visible to most who inquire. Your scientists will discover some radioactivity on Mars that cannot be explained solely by natural rock formations. This is the residue of the atomic explosions, since some of the elements used have a half-life of millions of years. What happened to the 90 million or so souls that did not go underground? You guessed it, they migrated to Earth and reincarnated into the melting pot of Pleiadian, Orion, Draconian and other groups that had reorganized since the destruction of Pan. This is the end of Part 5. We are the founders. The Founders on Earth History. Part 6. Received by Sal Rachel, May 19, 2005. Beloved creators, we are the founders, coming to you in the infinite light and love of the Creator. Today's discourse begins a new level of information that comes with a disclaimer. The material given in this discourse and the ones that follow is based on information that has been heavily suppressed by certain powers and influences that have been in control of your planet for a very long time. It is our intention to reveal the information that has been suppressed and to do so in the clearest and most accurate way possible. We are not aware of any souls in earthly embodiment that have disseminated this information in the past with 100% accuracy. This is due to the difficulty involved in extracting the information from the Akashic records. Although all information in the universe is freely available to anyone who sincerely requests it, only those souls that are no longer able to be influenced by the councils of Rigel and the Draconian councils have been successful in getting through the system of distortion placed in the ethers about your planet. In some of your channeled writings, this etheric distortion is referred to as the frequency barrier. Until recently we have not been allowed by the Godhead to tamper with this etheric distortion field. It has only been since about 1950 AD in your timeline that divine intervention has included the ability to remove etheric distortion fields from your planetary sphere. In later discourses we will examine the levels of veiling put upon your vibratory sphere and the reasons for each veil. Some of the veils are a naturally occurring phenomenon related to the drop in vibration experienced by seventh density souls on their way to experience third density reality. Others were placed intentionally by various benevolent factions in order to prevent the so-called dark forces from gaining too much power and thereby violating the free will of ascending souls. Other veils were placed intentionally by so-called dark forces in order to prevent ascending souls from gaining enough power to put an end to Orion, Draco and Sirian involvement with Earth. Since there are apparently no earthly souls that have been able to extract all this information successfully, we caution that this channel may not be able to extract all the information. Sal Rachel and the founders make no guarantees of complete accuracy for any of the channeled information given here. We urge extreme discernment when viewing any channeled material and would encourage you to be wary of any channeled material that claims to be 100% accurate. That said, we need to lay some groundwork for what is about to be discussed. The Luciferian rebellion is discussed at length in some of your religious writings, including a highly distorted book called Urantia, that to the best of our knowledge was brought to Earth by the councils of Andromeda. The information contained in that book was offered by various entities in the Andromedan councils who attempted to access the Akashic records during the period 10 million BC to the time of Jesus Christ. Some of the information is accurate and useful, but the Andromedan entities were unable to pierce some of the veils surrounding the period detailed in these discourses. Therefore, many of these entities relied on second-hand information given them by various members of the councils of Betelgeuse, and members of Sirius A and Sirius B, who were participants in the Earth experiment during the time periods covered herein. Many of the archangels and ascended masters had accurate information pertaining to that time period, but were not allowed to disseminate the information due to violations of free will and non-interference. The energy transmissions of our group, the founders, and several other high-density groups, are sufficiently able to pierce all the veils, regardless of who or what put them in place. There are certain visualizations and DNA code patterns associated with the stargates and portals that must be accessed in order to pierce the veils. The ancient mystery schools existing at various times on your planet were set up primarily to move souls along the spiritual path to the point of being able to access these stargates and portals. The system of initiations and rituals given through such secret and not-so-secret orders, as the Brotherhood of Masons, the Rosy Cross, Rosicrucians, the Order of the White Rose, and the Order of the Purple Rose, were for the express purpose of teaching souls to pierce the veils. In the beginning of these organizations, a number of souls attained knowledge of the stargates and portals and were able to pierce some of the veils. However, these souls were not evolved spiritually to the point of being able to remain pure in heart and mind, and many misused the information given. Due to lack of discernment, they gave the DNA codes to various negatively polarized ET groups, which enabled these groups to enter the stargates and portals and wreak havoc in the astral and etheric planes of Earth. These entities merged their DNA codes with the codes of evolving Earth souls, both directly through energy transmissions and through mass incarnations, thereby corrupting the original intent of the secret and not-so-secret mystical orders. All of the mystery schools mentioned above, and several others, have been infiltrated by negatively polarized ET factions, and as a result, the leaders of these organizations are controlled largely by the ego-based desire for power and control over others. This ego-based lust for power and control can be very devious and subtle, masquerading as one-upsmanship and spiritual pride at having achieved this level or that level in the organization. With each level attained, the individual accumulates a greater degree of responsibility for the functioning of the organization and regulation of its members. This is especially dangerous when the ego is in charge. There have been numerous well-meaning world leaders who have gotten caught up in these negatively polarized energy fields, while still believing they are doing the work of God. This is one of the reasons certain elements of this information have not been revealed until this time. We, the founders, are confident that there are now enough souls pure in heart and mind that would not, under any circumstances, misuse the information that we are giving it through several channels at this time, including this one. We are not giving actual DNA code configurations during this current transmission, but we are giving the energy patterns necessary to pierce the veils. Some souls who attune to these messages will be sufficiently evolved to be able to pierce the veils directly. Others will need the proper DNA keys and codes, which will be given later. It is not our intent to withhold any information that is needed by your planetary light workers. However, even at our level of awareness and vibration, we have made what you would call errors of judgment in times past that partially led to the current situation on Earth. To the best of our knowledge, there are no ET groups or channeled entities that are immune to these errors of judgment. Free will is a complicated and challenging principle at all levels of evolution. While we thoroughly understand the mechanics of free will, we use the utmost caution and respect when making decisions that affect the free will of millions of Earth souls. Up until about 1950 AD, there were virtually no controls in place to prevent the light and dark factions from battling it out to the bitter end. With the advent of nuclear weaponry, all that changed, and the Godhead issued the decree of divine intervention that most of you know about, allowing direct intervention in certain matters, when it was determined that such intervention would prevent the violation of free will of a large number of Earth souls. Once souls on your planet reach an inner vibratory rate of fifth density awareness, their well-being is protected by our dispensations, as carried out faithfully according to divine principle. One of your scientists, a Dr. Hawkins, devised a vibratory scale that is rather crude, but somewhat useful, and we will use that scale to make our point here. Those souls whose inner calibration level is 500 or above, or whose outer calibration level is 400 or above, automatically enter a protective field of energy generated by our members and certain other high-density groups involved in implementing the divine dispensation. At this time, there are approximately 16 million souls on your planet vibrating at or above the levels indicated. Keep in mind, beloved creators, this is not a pecking order or device with which to feel more or less worthy. All of God's creations are worthy. Everyone on your planet deserves God's love. There is not one soul unworthy of being saved. Anyway, this is not about being saved. This is about being granted access to the stargates and portals necessary to assist humanity in breaking free of the effects of the Luciferian rebellion, which we shall discuss in a moment. Only those souls with pure minds and hearts are being allowed to access the sacred DNA keys and codes and enter the stargates and portals responsible for maintaining the veils of illusion on your planet. Any soul who sincerely desires to be free can and will be free. This is divine law. Ask and ye shall receive is as valid today as it was in the time of Jesus. However, there are certain safeguards built into the ethers and astral regions of your planet that were necessary in order to respect the free will of souls evolving on your world. We will have more to say on this later, but at this point we will get on with your history. The pre-Lemurian period on your world corresponds roughly to 10 million BC until about 1 million BC. During that time your world slowly recovered from the Great Flood and life forms began to proliferate once again. After the destruction of Maldek and the atmosphere of Mars, many of those souls came to Earth and reincarnated, dramatically raising the population. Earth was once again mainly a tropical jungle, with about 90% water cover, and only the polar regions were cool by comparison. Like attracts like, and as the souls from Maldek and Mars continued coming to Earth, the vibratory rate of Earth dropped to match their vibrations. When the awareness level of Earth dropped below 5th density, souls from neighboring systems were able to access the stargates and portals surrounding Earth, which were not regulated at that time, except by the law of attraction. Although the Orions and Draconians already had a foothold on Earth, they came by leaps and bounds once the vibration dropped below 5th density. This is the end of part 6. We are the founders. The Founders on Earth History. Part 7. Received by Sal Rachel, May 20, 2005. Channel's note: this section was revised and edited several times with the assistance of the Founders in order to make it more readable and consistent chronologically. The words Dracos and Draconians are used interchangeably, but refer to souls originating in the Alpha Draconis star system. Greetings again, beloved creators. We are the Founders, continuing our discourse and offering insight on the Luciferian rebellion. Up until about 500,000 years ago in your timeline, Earth continued to attract more and more souls from across the universe. The vibratory level of these souls was generally 4th density, meaning that they were subject to the astral and etheric distortions inherent within that level of vibration. The genetics were now a blend of many races, but the Orions gradually began to dominate. War between Rigel and Betelgeuse had made life rather intolerable for many Orions, and Earth was seen as a place to begin life anew. Unlike the Dracos, the Orions were able to easily land directly on the Earth, in addition to coming through the incarnational process, and so their numbers increased significantly faster than the Dracos, whose reptilian bodies had a hard time adjusting to Earth's atmosphere and gravity. We, the Founders, observed with dismay what was going on, but because we were not allowed to interfere, we were like lab technicians watching a specimen multiply out of control and doing nothing to contain it. A group of archangels and ascended beings from 7th, 8th and 9th density were also watching the Earth. Several of these beings are well known to Earth's people, including Archangel Michael. An ascended being that was later given the name Lucifer was among those watching the progress of Earth. Lucifer devised a plan to lessen the chaos on Earth by teaching Earth souls how to control their emotions and use their intellectual capabilities so they would not be as easily swayed by the negatively polarized factions. Lucifer mistakenly attributed the decaying situation on Earth to unbridled emotions and passion. A group of souls headed by Lucifer came to Earth and established a series of mystery schools designed to train souls in suppressing and controlling the emotional body. The plan backfired, because as the students learned to suppress their emotions, their souls became more and more fragmented until their vibration dropped below 4th density into 3rd density. Suppressing any part of the self results in a loss of power and awareness. The shaming of emotion in men, the Victorian suppression of sexual desire and the making of feelings wrong all had their origins in Lucifer's philosophy. Archangel Michael, seeing what was happening on Earth, found that he could sit by no longer simply watching, and so he headed a group of ascended beings who voluntarily dropped their vibration and came to Earth. establishing another mystery school designed to raise the vibrations of souls back into the light. Once Michael and his group arrived on Earth, the vibrations were so dense that he and his band of celestial helpers became caught in the game of duality and started seeing the negatively oriented factions as evil forces to be overcome. Thus these archangels reinforced the concept of light versus dark on your world. Michael took the side of the light, and many members of the councils of Rigel, as well as most of the Dracos, took the polarity of the dark. Meanwhile, Lucifer and his group maintained their cool, calm aloofness, becoming armchair strategists, watching with interest the battles taking shape. He became so fascinated with this drama of duality that he began building up both sides, through training the light and dark forces to fight each other in the interests of seeing who would be supreme victors. The missing ingredient in all of this was compassion. Lucifer taught the soldiers on the battlefield to suppress their emotions and become hardened to misery and suffering. Archangel Michael taught the soldiers to be passionate and forceful in overcoming the dark forces. When Lucifer saw what Michael was doing, he turned his attention from the Orions and waged war on Michael's forces, and a great battle ensued in the astral and etheric planes above Earth. This became known as the War in the Heavens. Michael's forces were passionate about becoming victors over darkness. Lucifer's forces were cool, calm, and intellectual and waged their wars through cunning strategy. The third force in all this, the negatively polarized Orions and Draconians, proliferated as their primary foes were now at war with each other. The war in the heavens lasted about 1,000 years, taking place in roughly 500,000 BC. During the period from 1 million BC until 500,000 BC, the population of Earth grew from about 200 million to almost a billion people. Because the wars were largely off-planet and did not significantly impact the surface of the Earth or the subterranean cultures, the population did not drop that much during the Luciferian rebellion. Most of the surface fighting was regional and involved conventional weapons. After about 1,000 years of fighting, a truce was declared, and Lucifer and his group agreed not to promote overt aggression against anyone in the Earth system. Michael realized the futility of fighting the darkness, and also the futility of trying to overcome the suppression of emotional energy by force, and withdrew back into the celestial realms to integrate the lessons learned. Between 500,000 BC and 200,000 BC, life gradually evolved on Earth, and a few souls recaptured their fourth density awareness and began learning how to live cooperatively. During this same period, many more souls came from all over the galaxy, and Earth truly became a melting pot. However, the biggest groups were still the Orions from Betelgeuse and Rigel. During the Luciferian rebellion, the councils of Betelgeuse sided with Michael and the light forces, while the councils of Rigel sided with the dark forces. Although there was very little overt hostility during the transition time. Following the rebellion, both Orion groups generally confined their breeding to their respective polarities, thereby retaining their DNA structure. The Betelgeuse factions remained more peaceful, while the Rigel factions continued to be domineering and aggressive. The pinnacle of population during these times reached almost 1.5 billion, just before a grand cycle around 200,000 BC. The first period of Lemuria started about 200,000 BC, after one of the grand cycles of 25,920 years had completed. This particular shift wiped out about half of Earth's population through massive earthquakes. Their shift caused certain lands to break up and move apart, and one land mass became particularly fertile ground for the development of rather benign civilization. Souls who were attracted to this landmass were generally peaceful people, some originating in the Pleiadian sector and some from Sirius and Orion. This continent became roughly the size of Australia and was located almost on the same longitude, but a bit further north. What most historians do not realize is that civilization continued on the other continents during the first period of Lemuria, even though the vibration of the other continents was not as refined as it was on Lemuria. This first Lemurian civilization was later called the Land of Mu. It consisted of nearly 500 million souls at its pinnacle. About 3 grand cycles later, their EM fluctuations were such that another catastrophe ensued and all the land masses except Lemuria became flooded. Most of the souls who perished in the surrounding continents migrated, reincarnated, on Lemuria, and the population of Lemuria began to skyrocket. This became the second Lemurian period. This period was roughly from about 122,000 BC until about 100,000 BC. At the height of this second Lemurian civilization, the population again reached almost 1 billion people. These souls were not technologically oriented, but were tribal in nature, enjoying music and rhythm, and living in large cities along the coasts. Around 100,000 BC, the comet Annan-Fusak made a particularly close approach to Earth, and the tail brushed the atmosphere, causing dramatic cooling. The Lemurian people were used to the warm, tropical climate, and all of a sudden the temperature dropped 50 degrees Fahrenheit in literally hours, freezing most of them. Those who knew what was coming fled to the sea. Many walked into the sea and drowned. A few tried to build undersea cities, but were largely unsuccessful. There are many legends of the sea that originated during this period. The Lemurian landmass eventually sank beneath the sea, due to EM storms that followed the passage of the comet. There were only a handful of survivors and they migrated to what is now South America, and Australia, and later Hawaii and the Philippines. What has not been revealed before, and what has been heavily suppressed on Earth, is that the Alpha Draconians were behind the unusually close passage of the comet. Through a series of nuclear explosions in space, they deliberately forced the trajectory of the comet closer to Earth in order to destroy the civilizations there. The plan was to wipe out the existing life on Earth and then land and claim the Earth for themselves. They were partially successful in this regard, but landing in their native bodies on Earth was a whole lot harder than incarnating into millions of already existing bodies. Suffice to say that they had a hard time surviving in their reptilian bodies, due to the unfavorable gravity and mixture of gases in the atmosphere. Their native bodies mutated and grew in size as they adapted, although their overall numbers remained small. This was the main period that gave rise to the legends of dragons roaming the Earth. The Draconians, not to be defeated that easily, spent long years in laboratories aboard their spacecraft splicing and mutating various DNA samples until they came up with a human Draco hybrid. The secret involved injecting reptilian DNA into the cerebellum section of the brain where it quickly mutated the entire system. This part of the human is today still called the reptilian brain. While the characteristics of this part involve aggressive and competitive behavior and the fight-or-flight syndrome designed to protect the organism, these characteristics, when combined with Orion DNA, became especially potent and dominated the entire organism. Today, about 80% of the DNA in humans is Orion in origin, or maybe we should say, Orion-Draco hybrid. What is commonly thought to be human nature is the result of this DNA manipulation by the Draconians and subsequent incarnation by the Orions. As stated in this channel's earlier works, Our original DNA blueprint that we were so proud of was reduced to less than 20% of the overall makeup of human beings. Due to the low survival rate of the Draconians after the destruction of Lemuria, the percentage of humans with true reptilian DNA on Earth has remained rather low. Most of the settling of Earth after 100,000 BC and before Atlantis was done by the councils of Rigel and councils of Betelgeuse from Orion. Note, long after the wars in the Orion sector came to an end, over 100,000 years ago, many of the factions that migrated to Earth continue to stay locked in battle mentality to the present day. As you can see by looking around, this trait ranges from civilized militarism and fervent patriotism to overt hostility and barbaric customs. This is the end of Part 7. We are the founders. The Founders on Earth History. Part 8. Received by Sal Rachel, May 19, 2005. Greetings, beloveds. This is a continuation from Part 7. We are the Founders. We feel it important to add an explanation here regarding the veils and levels of distortion existing on and above your world during the transition from Lemuria to Atlantis. Both the Alpha Draconians and the Orions had fleets of ships orbiting the Earth during this period. These ships were largely in fourth density. The two groups had a loose alliance based on trading of technology in exchange for keeping hostilities at bay. One of the technologies they had developed was a high-intensity electromagnetic beam capable of disrupting the etheric fields around the Earth. In order to keep their enemies from coming to Earth, they created a force field using this technology. This field not only kept incoming ET groups at bay, but it created a distortion in the Akashic fields surrounding the Earth. Although the main library of Akasha does not have a location in time and space, this area above Earth's atmosphere constituted a portal into the Akashic. This is one of the reasons retrieving information during this time period has been so difficult. Another important factor to consider here, and one that has been written about in your books, is the quarantine that went into effect after the destruction of Lemuria. Because the vibratory level of humans had dropped so significantly, Earth was no longer considered a safe and desirable place on which to settle peaceful, loving groups. To prevent the Orions and Draconians from corrupting astral and etheric civilizations on neighboring worlds, a force field was put into place by the seventh density, Pleiadians, to keep Earth's business confined to Earth. This veil was not lifted until approximately 1987 AD. The time known as harmonic convergence. Once Earth's instability settled down after the destruction of Lemuria, the Draconians landed and attempted to proliferate, but had a hard time in their reptilian bodies. They then resorted to incarnating through the surviving Lemurians on a relatively stable land mass in what is now the Atlantic Ocean. At the same time, groups of Pleiadians saw the opportunity to once again settle the Earth, and they came as well, despite the quarantine. The councils of Rigel and Betelgeuse from Orion also came, and they found the atmosphere of Earth nearly ideal for rapid proliferation. The DNA of the survivors was now primarily Orion, with some Sirian, Andromedan, and Draconian energy as well. As the new civilization began to emerge, the Pleiadian, Orion and Draconian DNA began to mutate, and the new beings became more scientific and intellectual in their evolution. Thus began the first period of Atlantis. These humans still had the reptilian brain, but their cerebral cortex also contained elements of higher Pleiadian virtues and understanding. a civilization began to develop that is very much like the one that exists today, with all manner of technological achievements. The higher Pleiadian mind combined with the passion of the Orions and the competition of the Draconians resulted in a structured world of machines and great architecture. Michael and his legions, having been humbled by their mistakes of times past, once again tried to influence the more evolved souls of Atlantis. The councils of Rigel, having backed off during Earth's instability, once again took an interest in what was happening. In addition to the large numbers of their people incarnating into human form, they maintained a presence in spacecraft above the Atlantean continent. Obviously the quarantine had not worked, and once again Earth was a magnet for all sorts of savory and unsavory characters. The first period of Atlantis came to a partial halt during the end of the Grand Cycle in approximately 50,000 BC. However, the civilization was rebuilt and the final period of Atlantis began. There is much fairly accurate information about Atlantis in several of your channeled writings, including the works of Alice Bailey and Edgar Cayce. We will not duplicate that effort. We will say, however, that the downfall of the second Atlantis occurred in about 23,200 BC. And was due to the misuse of crystalline energy generation systems. We will give a brief accounting of how this transpired. About 2,000 years before the end of Atlantis, the Atlanteans developed radionics devices using quartz crystals. They were able to generate all the energy they needed for virtually every part of their civilization. This energy was powerful enough to tempt the unsavory aspects of the society. Several Atlantean scientists made deals with Orion groups orbiting the Earth, trading technology in an attempt to gain superiority. This is similar to what is occurring today between certain Earth factions and their Zeta Reticulans. The Orion-based insurgents wanted greater and greater power from the energy-generating crystals, and they began engineering them to be used as weapons. They never got the chance to wage war, because one of the particularly strong crystal generators exploded, sinking the continent and most of her inhabitants. Only a tiny handful escaped in airships and an even smaller number in sea-going vessels. Over 90% of those that tried to escape by sea were drowned in massive tsunamis. Those that fled in airships relocated to what is now Central and South America, as well as Egypt. This channel has discovered that nearly all of the people he works with in past life remembrance and healing sessions had an integral part in the downfall of Atlantis. We, the founders, remained largely in observation mode as usual during this period. It was our perception that what really destroyed Atlantis was an imbalance between the head and the heart. The scientifically oriented hybrids of the Atlantean period had once again suppressed their emotions in a manner similar to the Luciferians, and in so doing, most Atlanteans lost their ability to discern between energies that were supportive of spiritual growth and those that merely led to the accumulation of physical, astral and etheric power. Had the inhabitants of Atlantis been balanced in their emotional and mental bodies, they would have seen what was happening and been able to take steps to prevent it. We see a similar scenario being played out in your modern world today. We will say that you are very close to where you were at the time of the destruction of Atlantis. However, there are two important differences. The divine dispensation is allowing a large number of souls to awaken to higher states of consciousness today, and there are many benevolent ET groups that are closely monitoring the state of affairs on your world and will act in an instant to prevent large-scale nuclear war. In addition, these groups have sophisticated technologies that can detect exotic and unusual weapons before they are tested. We have not yet covered a very important part of your history, that of the Egyptian, biblical and Greek periods. there is another player in the drama that forcefully shaped the cultures emerging after Atlantis, and that was the Syrians. In the next section, we will examine the role of the Syrians in Jewish, Christian and Greek mythology. In addition, we will offer our perspective on what really happened during the time of Jesus, who he was, what he actually did, and where the distortions lie in the official historical accounting. We will also take a brief look at the Aztec, Toltec and Mayan cultures at a later date. We are the founders. The Founders on Earth's History. Part 9. Received by Sal Rachel, May 26, 2005. Greetings, beloved creators. We are back already with more on your history. There are two time periods that have held fascination with many of you for a long time, and that is ancient Egypt and the time of Jesus Christ. We will spend a little time on those two sagas now, without forgetting the South American and native North American story, to be given at a later date. The so-called battle between light and dark continued after the destruction of Atlantis. Your world seemed to seesaw between periods of brief enlightenment, followed by times of corruption and relative darkness. Egypt was a case in point. A group of seventh density Pleiadians, determined to restore the blueprint of humanity, long lost to Orion, Draco, Sirian, Andromedan and other renegade groups, took advantage of the fact that the few survivors of Atlantis were relatively pure in heart and mind. Those that landed along the Nile River were the first to be visited by the Pleiadian Welcoming Committee. This contingent was headed by a teacher later named Thoth who, contrary to ancient writings, did not have the head of a bird or reptile. The creature depicted as such was a Draco-Andromedan hybrid who came along much later and corrupted the teachings of Thoth. Thoth was a radiant being of blue-white light, a humanoid with similar color and energy to ourselves in the higher realms. He was able to step his vibration down far enough to communicate directly with the descendants of Atlantis and to teach them in the ways of truth, cooperation, harmony and higher mathematics. As many channeled writings will confirm, Thoth was the engineer behind the Great Pyramid. This device served several purposes, but its primary function was an ascension chamber and controller of Earth's grid system. As correctly pointed out by your Egyptologists, it was aligned with Mintaka, the central star in Orion's belt. Mintaka became the central point in Orion's enlightened government, following the resolution of the Rigel-Betelgeuse Wars about 100,000 years ago. Mintaka also had geographical and geological significance in that it indicated a central axis point of Earth's precession of grand cycles, occurring every 25,920 years, approximately. The grid system of Earth was correlated with the point at Giza, being the center of the grid, and lines and vortexes coming off at various sacred geometric angles therefrom. The Martians, during their heyday, had a similar grid system constructed at the same latitude and longitude on their planet, also engineered by seventh density Pleiadians, but alas, it never achieved its potential as a portal for ascension, due to interference from Orion and Draco factions. Another strategic purpose of the Great Pyramid was to serve as an incoming portal for groups of Pleiadians so that the purity and vision of the original blueprint would have a fighting chance of getting re-established on Earth. Thoth and his group had a fair degree of success in working with the Atlanteans to construct temples of initiation and soul evolution along the banks of the Nile. Of the several thousand Atlanteans who made this area their home, a significant percentage took part in the ascension activities and initiations in the Great Pyramid. The seventh density Pleiadians constructed the device in a matter of days, using levitation and laser technology. A series of passageways were designed to accommodate those who needed extended periods inside the device in order to accelerate their ascension templates in preparation for moving into fifth density light bodies. The subterranean chambers beneath the geyser plateau were already inhabited by those who had escaped underground during previous conflagrations. The Pleiadians, in concert with these underground groups, established the Hall of Records several thousand feet below the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx was later erected by another group of Egyptians to mark the entrance to the portal. The pyramid was completed in approximately 10,500 BC. It has only been in the last 20 years that scientists on your world have correctly dated the Great Pyramid. Until recently it was assumed this device was linked to various other pyramids that were constructed, using the labor of the Egyptian people, to serve as tombs for the pharaohs. This channel goes into detail, in his book, on the lame attempts by later Egyptians to reconstruct the ascension chambers after Egypt had fallen to the Syrians. We will have more on that later. Accounts from adepts of the original mystery schools of Thoth can be found sporadically in various stone tablets and channeled writings, including the emerald tablets. Essentially, they document the initiations given to prepare the fourth density souls for ascension into fifth density. Ancient Egypt thrived until about 7500 BC, at which time seventh density Syrians from the Sirius B star system arrived on the scene and began unraveling the work of Thoth and his group. The Christian, Jewish and Greek legends and myths are all about the Syrians. Although these ET factions had great technological and psychic power, they had not resolved their egoic issues satisfactorily and as a result, became infatuated with worship and praise by their underlings. In other words, they were on a guru trip, to quote a popular phrase. At first it was subtle. They demonstrated their miraculous powers to those who did not have the spiritual understanding to see through the charade. As they intermingled and interbred, their DNA of the descendants became more and more polluted with their brand of egoistic messiahship. The mystery schools began to devolve into pecking orders and devotion to Syrian gods. The God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, was a seventh density Syrian. Those of you familiar with Jehovah's teachings, but unwilling to accept the premise that Jehovah was an egotistical Syrian, should examine the result of Jehovah's presence on the earth. As stated many times by this channel, the Old Testament is one of the bloodiest and most violent books ever written. Would a highly evolved, enlightened being pit one race against another? Would he order blind obedience to his principles? Would he exalt some over others? In God's universe, there are no elite or chosen ones. Everyone is chosen and is created in pure love and innocence. Everyone has equal value in the eyes of God, and that value is infinite. Biblical scholars, Jewish and Christian clerics on your world need to go back to basics and examine the results of ancient teachings. Did they promote peace and evolution of awareness, or did they promote division and conflict? We, the founders, seldom preach, but this point is too important to let pass. Now on with the show. We return you to Egypt during its fall into worship and sacrifice. At the same time as the Syrian invasion, after 7500 BC, the Orions and Dracos began arriving on the scene, and a degree of interbreeding ensued, resulting in many of the part reptilian, part avian, part human forms depicted in later Egyptian drawings. The bird people were a hybrid Draco-Andromedan race, the result of creative DNA engineering, and they attempted to land their native forms on the Earth, with partial success. They, like the Syrians, used their superior technology and psychic powers to enslave the docile inhabitants of Egypt. You can find drawings of the Syrian and Draco-Andromedan gods on the walls of caves throughout Egypt. The pure in heart and mind, seeing the experiment once again go awry, sadly retreated back to the inner planes, and a period of relative darkness descended over Egypt. The ritual sacrifices, mummies, and mystery schools of the pharaohs were all the manifestation of Syrian, Orion, Draco and Andromedan corruption of the original Pleiadian teachings. Had the teachings of Thoth been fully integrated by his students, they never would have been corruptible. The lesson here should be obvious by now. Unless you have fully integrated your ego and higher consciousness, you can be led astray by seemingly well-meaning teachers who themselves have not integrated their egos with spirit. This is the end of part 9. We are the founders. The founders on Earth history. Part 10. Received by Sal Rachel, May 27, 2005. Greetings once again. We are the founders. Let us recap and say a few words about the story so far. As many of you know, we have left a lot out and skipped some major periods and events. This is for the sake of brevity. If this channel is willing, we will include these missing pieces in an upcoming book. We have enough information to fill several books, and we feel it is vital that this material be disseminated as you approach the next grand cycle. We will have a special discourse on the implications of cosmic cycles in the near future. We have not touched on the significance of the ancient Hebrew teachings, the Tree of Life, Kabbalah, or other aspects of the higher teachings brought forth since the time of Atlantis by various enlightened members of the Pleiadian, Andromedan, Syrian, Orion, Arcturian, and other groups. We have also had very little to say about the Galactic Confederation, the Great White Brotherhood, the Archangelic Orders, and the Universal Orders, including the Order of Melchizedek. This channel has a strong Venusian connection, another ET faction that deserves mention in future segments. 1/8 density member of the Confederation, in fact its leading member in this sector of the galaxy, has a special story that we joyfully relate below. At this time, we wish to illuminate your minds regarding the real story of Jesus Christ. It is important to note that the allegorical storyline of one being sacrificed to heal the sins of the masses did not originate with the events 2,000 years ago, but is a theme that has been repeated many times throughout history, long before the man you know as Jesus was carried to the cross. If you dig into the history of different cultures, you will find other such icons whose stories are very similar to that of Jesus. The idea that a savior died for your sins, and the playing out of that drama in a form similar to Jesus, is an attempt by the Dark Lords to get humanity to place the blame outside of themselves in order to keep their problems from being solved. Let's get this straight. Nobody can ever die for your sins, beloveds. That is for two reasons. 1, you have free will and are responsible for everything you do. And, 2, there is no such thing as an unpardonable error, or an error that causes you to be defective. You are as perfect as the day God created you, and you will always be perfect and innocent and holy. Lord Sananda, in his book Set, A Course in Miracles, made that very clear. There are some factual aspects to the story as told in the New Testament of the Bible, but there are many distortions. Allow us to elaborate. The soul known as Jesus was a direct fragment of the Sananda lineage. In other words, Sananda was the oversoul of Jesus. Sananda, having watched as humankind once again floundered in sorrow and ignorance, and having a desire to intervene in the affairs of man in a way that respected free will, incarnated in approximately 39 BC, as the son of Joseph and Mary. This much is in general agreement with the biblical story. Jesus' birth date was approximately March 31st. Lord Sananda, an eighth density celestial being, incarnated as Jeshua, or Joshua, depending on whose translation you use. Being from eighth density, he retained many of his spiritual abilities, despite the very dense environment he was born into. As a young child he was very psychic and foresaw many of the events that would later come to pass. Mary and Joseph were at odds with the political establishment to some degree, and they were not married when Mary became pregnant. The virgin birth story is made up. Certain ET factions have the capabilities of impregnating women without going through normal sexual means, but in this case Jeshua came in through normal means. To avoid the social and political consequences of giving birth out of wedlock, and to remove themselves from the oppressive beliefs of the authorities, Mary and Joseph migrated toward Galilee, and eventually near the Dead Sea, where they briefly took refuge with the Essenes. Mary and Joseph left Jeshua in their care and returned to Galilee. Jeshua later joined the Essene order. He spent 3 years building temples and housing for the Essenes, while attending their sacred teachings and learning the Essene way. Along the banks of the Dead Sea, Jeshua learned to have respect for Mother Earth and had a hand in helping bring the much-needed rain, scarce in that region. The Essenes were strict vegetarians and taught a respect for all life forms. They were regarded as strange and antisocial by the governments of the land, but were left largely alone, as they seemed to pose no threat, and always paid their taxes, even though they did not believe in such matters. When Jeshua turned about 16, he and a group of fellow Essenes traveled east to India, where he met several Indian gurus and saints. He studied for about 2 years with a guru, who taught him a great deal about the mysteries of life. When he returned, and during a dangerous visit to see his parents in Galilee, he met and fell in love with Mary Magdalene, who was a dancer and entertainer, and only very briefly prostituted herself when times were tough. Mary Magdalene and Jeshua were deeply in love with each other and had a child. Because they were not married, they too became social outlaws. Some of Jeshua's Essene friends allowed Mary Magdalene to stay at the temples with Jeshua, against the rules of the elders. Jeshua, Mary Magdalene and their young son traveled to India a second time, where the child was blessed by the gurus. Word got out that Mary Magdalene had an illegitimate child, although nobody seemed to know the father, outside of the Essenes. Fearing for the child's life, Miriam and Jeshua left the child temporarily in the care of an Indian saint, and returned to Galilee. It was a few years later before they could return to India, and although they missed their son terribly, they knew he was all right. Mary Magdalene and Jeshua paid another visit to their son a few years later, but he remained in the care of the Indian saints when they returned. The political climate was too unstable to risk bringing the child back with them to Galilee. Despite the short time they spent with their son, their influence helped him greatly as he grew up in India. Their son became a wise sage and his teachings added significantly to the climate of India. Jeshua received several visions from Spirit and his soul family and was told to teach higher spiritual principles to anyone who would listen sincerely. He began teaching earnestly in his late 20s, and gathered quite a following. At one point he had about 50 disciples. He and Mary Magdalene kept their relationship and child a complete secret, not even discussing this with the closest disciples. Being highly clairvoyant, Jeshua saw that the authorities would eventually kill him, but he was told by his own God self to stay his course and teach as many people as possible the ways of spirit. Jeshua's teachings were highly distorted in the Bible, but a few truths managed to get through. He taught that we are all created in the image and likeness of our Creator, and that we all have the abilities he demonstrated. He taught us to love one another and to forgive our enemies. He did not teach that the way to God was through him alone. Several of his disciples learned how to use their spiritual gifts of healing and clairvoyance, and there are ample stories in the Bible of John going on to perform similar healings. The story of Jeshua's involvement in the Melchizedek priesthood is also in the Bible, in Hebrews chapter 7. Once Jeshua reached a certain level of awareness, his cosmic family in the celestial realms began communicating with him and reminding him of his position within the Melchizedek priesthood. When Jeshua was brought to the cross, he immediately left his body consciously, instead of suffering for 3 days as is taught erroneously. During his life he continually forgave them, for they knew not what they did. After leaving his body, he holographically projected himself back into human form to appear to his disciples and Mary Magdalene on numerous occasions. The body left the tomb because grave robbers stole it. He had no need to resurrect it, as he was already able to materialize a new body once he returned to 8th density. Lord Sananda has fragmented his soul several more times throughout history. At the present time, there are 8 fragments of Sananda on the earth. Some of these souls believe they are Jesus, and to a certain extent they are correct. All great souls are capable of fragmenting themselves dozens of times in order to do service work on lower density planets. Usually oversouls fragment into 12 souls at a time, but this is not set in stone. Many fragments remain in the higher densities to guide the fragments in the lower worlds. The term fragment does not mean incomplete or partial. Each of these fragments is a complete and sovereign being. This channel uses the cell dividing analogy to explain this in his writings. The second coming of Christ refers to the return to Christ consciousness, or the celestial consciousness of higher densities. This was correctly interpreted by Your Paramahansa Yogananda, and many other yogis and saints. As most of you know, traditional Christianity has very little to do with the teachings of Jeshua, and a whole lot to do with sin and guilt. Fortunately, many souls are expanding their awareness beyond these primitive beliefs. We the founders are grateful to see so many truly doing the greater works that Jeshua taught. During this brief look at the work of Jeshua, we only touched briefly on Mary Magdalene and the Divine Feminine, and spoke hardly a word about Mother Mary. There are numerous channeled articles on these beings and we do not wish to duplicate the information. We hope we have set the record straight on the lifetime of the one you call Jesus. We are the founders,